Civil disobedience, classic civil disobedience, is what so many people who organized with Dr. Martin Luther King did. That was physically breaking a law which upheld the racist Jim Crow system they were challenging. They went to lunch counters and sat down and asked to be served when the local ordinances said that black people could not be served at white businesses. They boycotted the buses. They did all kinds of things and often were thrown in jail for it. That's civil disobedience, actually breaking a law that embodies the problem. And that's spectacular if you can do it. However, my activism is primarily challenging war making and the legal processes which are very convoluted and complicated to get to war making. There's not one specific law that I can go break, that if I break it will at least momentarily obstruct war. So I and my colleagues do what we call civil resistance, which is resisting the war system, or resisting the poverty system, resisting the capitalist system, resisting destroying the climate system. I do all those things too. War is my major focus, but it's not my only one. Those systems are very complicated. You can't just break one law that exactly embodies those systems. Civil resistance is pointing out the illegality of what the government is doing. We have a First Amendment right to assemble as citizens who are concerned about something. We have a First Amendment right to seek the redress of grievances. Whatever our grievances are, we have the right to present them and expect that they be redressed. And we also have international law rights and responsibilities. After World War II, Germany and Japan were tried. The German trials were in Nuremberg, and out of that came the Nuremberg Principles, which among other things say, and that was an earlier piece of the legal order that he talked about in the military. A lot of the people who were tried at the Nuremberg trial said I was just following orders. That is no defense. If you commit a crime because someone ordered you to do it, that is no defense. Following orders is not a defense. If you commit a crime, you committed a crime, regardless of why you did it. And another thing that came out of Nuremberg is that citizens have a responsibility, a right, and also a responsibility to object when their government is committing crimes. And those are the things we argue in court. That we have a First Amendment right to gather, and more, especially since 9/11, the government doesn't want people even gathering. We saw that 3 years ago with Occupy. That's when they did. Let me start on the other side this time. Back in 2008, I and some of my Veterans for Peace colleagues did a couple of huge battering actions at the National Archives in Washington, D.C. Now, the National Archives is where the original documents, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, the original documents are there, along with other important documents in our history. So we thought it was a very important place to go, and we displayed very large banners calling for the arrest of Bush and Cheney, who are war criminals, were committing war crimes. And once for 24 hours, and once for about 2 days until they finally ran us off, we occupied an area of the National Archives and were not arrested. In fact, the first action, I was the police liaison and I was talking to the Washington, D.C. police captain, and he said, "There's a document in that building that gives you the right to do what you're doing." That felt good. Sometimes they do acknowledge that. They did not arrest us. They could have, but they didn't. But when they do, and when you go to court, a lot of us activists would rather do a thing called going pro se. That is a Latin term. Many legal terms are Latin terms. Pro se means you defend yourself as opposed to being represented by an attorney. Now, we always have an advisory attorney to listen to the convoluted legal things. But if you represent yourself, you get the chance to say a lot more because the judge knows you're not an attorney and will give you some more leeway. So you get the chance to get some of your political arguments in there where an attorney wouldn't be able to. And it's just a matter of principle for a lot of us. We want to do the work ourselves. And going to court we consider part of the action. Just blockading or just occupying, it can be a good action, but going to court, making the arguments in court, especially if one can get a jury trial, and unfortunately every arrest does not result in a jury trial these days. A lot of the lower level ones, you only get a judge. Judges, of course, are very beholden to who put them on the bench, so they almost never challenge the system. Juries, however, will do so on occasion. It can be very exciting. Consensus is hard work, and sometimes in the short run it seems to take longer than just someone saying this is what we're going to do. But it brings everyone's ideas in, it brings everyone's ownership in. So it is a much better way to create the world we want to see, a world where cranking massive amounts of carbon dioxide into the air when we cannot continue to do that, a world where the horrendously wealthy just get more and more wealthy and the rest of us have our homes taken away from us and don't have jobs to go to and all that. A world where a lot of people live on a couple of dollars a day. Things like that cannot continue. And a lot of people around the world are challenging those things, and they have the right and the responsibility to do so. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights was created in 1946, and it provides a list of rights that every person should have. Political rights, absolutely, to vote in free and fair elections, to assemble and seek the redress of grievances, as our First Amendment says, to participate in one's government, but also material rights. The right to have enough food, a decent education, a decent place to live. Those things in the US tend to not be paid much attention to because capitalism requires an underclass that is always there to be preyed upon and given piddly, non-livable jobs so that other people can't demand higher incomes. But those bodily needs are part of what the United Nations recognizes. Part of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights says, everyone has the right to freedom of opinion and expression. This right includes freedom to hold opinions without interference and to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas through any media and regardless of frontiers. That's talking about borders. That's another issue, but a problem one. And everyone has the right to freedom of peaceful assembly and association. The Capitol. So it's a very important street in Washington, D.C. And engraved on the wall on the outside of the building facing Pennsylvania Avenue. Pennsylvania Avenue is often where marchers for various rights in D.C. march by. It's very interesting that engraved in, I'm going to guess, at least 6 or 8 inches tall letters is the First Amendment. It's pretty ironic to be marching down that street and seeing the reason you have the right to be marching in that street engraved up on a wall. Now, unfortunately, just because you have the right doesn't always mean you are allowed to use it. Of course, the authorities don't like it. They don't want us marching in the streets, possibly blocking traffic, possibly obstructing day-to-day business, possibly bothering people. And to answer some of you who may be thinking, well, why don't you do it in legal ways? Why don't you do it in acceptable ways? Why don't you do it go through the system? Why don't you lobby Congress? Why don't you write letters? Why don't you make phone calls? Activists do all those things frequently. In fact, there was an excellent British Broadcasting radio program that ran last Friday that talked about a survey that showed that activists are much more politically active in the recommended, prescribed, accepted legal ways than are other people. So when I get asked in court, why did you break the law? Why didn't you do it in the prescribed manner? I did. I do. I do that frequently. It doesn't seem to get us very far. But theoretically, at least, I believe in that process, and I do it, especially because I live in Baltimore.